Do you know why anti-black racism still exists? Because a black girl tried to get me fired. Because this tribe doesn't like that tribe. Because it's black men versus black women. It's the black heterosexuals versus the gays. Light skin versus dark skin. Muslims versus Christians. Black Christians versus the black Jews. Are you getting the gist of it? We can't move forward because we're constantly fighting each other. And yes, I know that it's part of, systemic racism. It's by design that we destroy each other. But until we realize that, hey, we have a common enemy here. And as long as we are fighting each other, we cannot dismantle white supremacy. As long as we do not understand this basic concept, and we're ready to settle for scraps, and I'll get into that in a little bit, then the system is always going to be here, and anti-black racism will always be here. A powerful, ruthless system will not be crushed when we're divided. It's a game about numbers. It's a numbers game. As black people, we cannot crush this heavy system when we cannot even agree on our own humanity. Does that make sense? We're fighting with this person because they're of a different religion, this one from a different tribe, this one is dark skinned, this one's sexuality, this one's gender. We're so busy fighting over things that don't even matter. How can we ask for our rights when we can't even agree on our own humanity? Black people really piss me off sometimes when we're fighting over things that are irrelevant. It really does bother me. Even as a group, we can't even put our differences aside to fight a common enemy. That's a problem. Now, about 2 weeks ago, I introduced you to Frantz Fanon. I'm probably butchering his name. He has another quote that I want to share with you. He says, "It is clear that in the colonial countries, the peasants alone are revolutionary, for they have nothing to lose and everything to gain. The starving peasant outside the class system is the first among the exploited to discover that only violence pays. For him there is no compensation, no possible coming to terms, colonization and decolonization a simple question of relative strength. For him there is no compromise, no possible coming to terms." What does he mean by this? In order for a revolution to happen, the majority of the people need to take to the streets. The majority of the people that are being oppressed need to revolt. And for those of you who know, I'm from Sudan. Last year we had a huge revolution where we were able to overthrow a 30-year-old dictatorship. We had a dictator who was running the country for 30 years. The country's situation got to a point that it was so bad that the average person there was not able to afford bread. It was difficult for them to afford buying bread. And that's why the revolution happened. Otherwise, people were going to be comfortable. They're going to take scraps and say, you know what, it's not that bad, it could be worse. That's just human behavior. When you know that things can be worse, you settle for less. So then he has another quote to add to that, which is, "What I call middle-class society is any society that becomes rigidified in predetermined forms, forbidding all revolution, all gains, all progress, all discovery. I call middle class a closed society in which life has no taste, in which the air is tainted, in which ideas and men are corrupt. And I think that a man who takes a stand against this death is in a sense a revolutionary." What he's saying is, in this quote, is that the middle class people are comfortable. They're comfortable, they have jobs. We have jobs, we can still, we're living paycheck to paycheck, but we are not in a position where we have to revolt. That's what he's saying. And the true revolutionaries are the people who are at the bottom, who have nothing to lose. That's why they revolt. However, a true revolutionary is somebody who is in the middle class, who has everything, and is able to see that this is not a way to live. Just because...
All right, enough of that. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So my name is D Moss. Welcome to On Deck, everybody. For all of our viewers, that was a clip that I found on YouTube. If my computer freezes at this point, I want to apologize to all of the viewers. If you'd like to donate to buy me a brand new MacBook, I will happily accept it. So, disclaimers out the way. So we're talking about Black unity. Is it real? Is it feasible? And if so, how do we do this? We have so many people operating from so many different schools of thought, so many different ideologies around Blackness, what it is, what it isn't, different viewpoints around how we even self-identify. Are we brown? Are we Black? Are we African, African-American? Are we colored, Negro? Whatever the case may be, everybody has a viewpoint. And when you're dealing with people who have influence over pockets of other folks within our community, people take their sex in different directions. So people often talk about we'll never get anything done as long as we don't come together and unify. The question is, how do we do that? W.B. Du Bois fought with Booker T. Washington around the direction of the Black community. He fought with Marcus Garvey around the direction of the Black community. We had Elaine Brown and the Black Panthers. We had versus Malana Karenga and their organization called US. Then we had divisions within the Black Panther Party. They were split within the Southern Christian leadership and the folks who splintered off and went with CORE. There's been so many differences. It's kind of like we have this tendency to splinter in a million different directions. You look at religious organizations. I know you have Refuge, the Church of God in Christ, the Pentecostal Assembly of the World. We just tend to splinter no matter what we do. So as we talk about Black unity, I'm just curious because everybody screams it. I'm just wondering, what's the solution? How do we do that? And what do it takes on Black unity? And how do you define Black unity? So with that being said, I'm going to open it up to our panelists, let them all introduce themselves briefly so that folks know who they are. So if you agree, disagree, you know who you're agreeing or disagreeing with. So I'll start from the top with Minnie Jones.
So I'm Minnie Jones. Hey y'all. As far as Black unity being possible, it's absolutely possible. Very, very necessary. How likely? I struggle with that. I don't know how likely it is to happen. I sure as hell don't know how likely it is to happen in my lifetime. And I think even more prevalent question is, what's it gonna take for us to get to the point where we don't see unity as an option?
Right. And that's the dilemma of the day. Hanif, introduce yourself, your viewpoint.
All right.
Or your thoughts.
My name is Hanif Nelson. My viewpoint is it's we have to look at what do we mean by unity, because one person will say unity is we all have to think the same, do the same, be the same. Another person will say, no, we have to have, some big goals in common, and then we may differ on some little things. So in order for us to say, is it possible? First, we need to define what it is. And then we need to look at what we're willing to do when we actually know what it is to begin with. And I'll stop there for now.
Okay, thank you. Sana.
Hi, I'm Shauna Joseph. I'm a law student at Western New England. And I actually agree 100% with what Hanif just said. I think the main thing is finding common goals and defining those goals. I'm a huge fan of writing things down and setting them in stone. And that's how a game plan is set in place. We fight, I think, more so too much over the little things that can be worked out at a later date. We need to come up with our main objectives and set those in stone, and then begin working together, maybe set up leaders in each part of our nation and making sure that we can get those things done.
Okay. Professor Matt.
My stance right now is black people are not to echo what everyone said so far. Black people are not a monolith. I think that the different groups within us, whether you're talking about the Divine Nine, the Black Panthers, Pan-Africans, Nation of Islam, all beliefs and values and causes that each of these different groups represent and fight for should be acknowledged However, when it comes to Black unity, I think what's going to get us there is, again, to echo what Shauna and Hanifa just mentioned, is finding those common goals and those common things that each of the groups want to rally behind and want to establish on a Black agenda. And when we come to an agreement on that Black agenda, that's the agenda that we take to Congress with. That's the agenda that we stick to when we are being asked for support from running politicians and other leaders that come into our communities. I think having a collective agreed upon agenda of some set goals that everybody kind of so that everyone supports would be a great start.
Okay. Thanks, Professor. Tom, you're on mute, sir.
There we go.
Yes,
Hi, everyone. My name is Tom Shepard. I am the elected parent member on the New York City School Board. And I've been thinking about this while we've been talking, and I will totally co-sign on what Hanif, Shauna, and Mac have said. For me, I think that when we talk about unity, that we do have to be clear about what we're talking about, right?
Okay.
I think that if we're gonna, I don't think that the real conversation is more about unity and identity as much as it is unity and purpose, right? Or, it's like, you look around and it ain't just Black folks that are, separate themselves by religion or ideology or sex or anything. You're like, society does it. But white folks will or with their whiteness, we get there, right? I think for Black folks, it's the same thing. And for me, my biggest example, and I think you alluded to it, was the civil rights movement. And I always looked at SCLC and SNCC, right? And you look at people like John Lewis and Dr. King, or you look, or Stokely Carmichael and Dr. King, right? Both wanted the same outcomes, and that was equality for Black people. Just the approach was different. So, in that, unity was around the purpose, right, or the goal, and the methods, and like how and what were really sort of the individual goals of individual groups. So I think this is a really good conversation because it allows us to get clarity around that, like the why are we in this, not necessarily the identity politics of it.
Okay. And just really briefly, I have another video. Hopefully it won't mess up. WB, and you'll see. Here we go.
One of the first moments where Du Bois comes onto the national stage is the brewing controversy between his ideas about racial progress and how to move the race forward, and the leading African-American figure of that time period, the late 19th and early 20th century, Booker T. Washington. In the beginning, they agreed on many points about the importance of education and moving the race forward. It turns out, though, that because Du Bois was northern born and had access to some of the best schools in New England and really was encouraged to think broadly, it's been part of his elite graduate education, being trained in Berlin, working with Max Weber. By contrast to Booker T. Washington, who was self-educated, a very gifted and talented man, but he was born as a slave. That fundamental difference certainly shaped their sense of change over time. The life that Booker T. Washington eventually led as the leading, most recognized figure of African American society meant that his expectations for what the white race was willing to do on behalf of black people were very different than of Du Bois. You could say Du Bois was a utopian idealist in some respects, and Booker T. Washington was a pragmatist, better known as an accommodationist. And so it set up an ongoing debate. Eventually, Booker T. Washington's program sustained the ethos of Jim Crow America because it was about black people working, but on white people's terms. It was about a lack of political enfranchisement because black people were subject to poll taxes and literacy tests and the inability to vote. And it was ultimately about a form of second-class citizenship that was segregated America. In this regard, Du Bois did see that real change, fundamental change, living up to the real promises of racial democracy in America depended upon agitation, depended upon a grasp for power.
Okay. With all that being said, listen to everybody's opening viewpoints. I mean, hold up. I just seen a comment. Seneca, who's going to be joining us in a few minutes, says, how about, as it pertains to Black unity, how about a centralized movement with specific goals, ideas, common objectives, but still allowing individuals and groups to move independently? As we talk about Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, and later on Marcus Garvey, everybody had the same goal. We want unity. We want equal treatment. We want equity. Everybody seeing the same endpoint. But again, it goes back to how do we get to the point where we develop specific goals, ideas, and common objectives? Who takes the lead on that? How do we tell someone to set aside their own personal agendas or whatever, mode they think we should be in? How do we get people to set that aside? I'm just kind of curious as to your thoughts on that.
While we were going through this,
yes,
I saw I looked up the definition of unity in the Merriam-Webster dictionary.
Yep.
And one of the it says the quality or state of not being multiple, oneness. But the second definition, the first part of it, is the one that caught my eye. It says a condition of harmony, accord. Now, the reason why that caught my eye is because, being a musician and being, a music educator, one thing that we have to talk about a lot is harmony, the notes that make up chords and songs. And one thing we have in harmony, which is really interesting, is like if you go to a piano and you take two notes that are a half step apart, and you play them together, it sounds dissonant. It sounds like really bad. It's clashing. It's not a sound that you want. But if you take those two notes that are a half step apart from each other that are dissonant, and you put a couple of other notes around them, now you don't hear the dissonance anymore. You hear a beautiful chord. There's harmony there. These two notes that are dissonant are now part of a larger work. And in the same kind of mindset and thinking, I think the larger framework is the thing that I think we have to all agree. If equality or equity is the larger framework, then there's room for multiple voices in that larger framework, as long as everyone is heading towards the same goal. Just like in music harmony, there's room for dissonance as long as you know how to put the right things around that dissonance. As long as you know how to put the right things around it so that you've got this tapestry of harmony that you're using as a vehicle to broadcast your thoughts and ideas. So like unity isn't, I've got to borrow a sci-fi reference, it's not like we're the Borg. We're going to assimilate everyone. Everyone's going to think the same thing and going to be the same thing. And that's what we're going to do. It's not that. It's we have the common goal. There are some things that we're going to do, because there's not a single one of us on this panel right now that can say that we think the exact same thing about this one topic. But yet we're here unified with the objective and goal of talking about what this is and how it could possibly come to fruition. So there's unity even amongst that thought of why we're here today. It doesn't mean we would all approach it the same way, but there is a common framework that we're working with or working towards.
Okay. Tom, I think I seen your finger up. Go for it.
You did. I was thinking about just history, right? And I think back to like 1972 and Black folks came together like this before in Gary, Indiana, right? And you had folks you had folks come from everywhere and represented all sorts of views and positions, right? And you know, hashed it out, and it was loud, it was ruckus. Like folks argued their positions, faithfully, and at the end of the day, they came up with a declaration, like a document that they were that they all sort of shared with the world, right? Like this is the result or the fruit of our labor. And the question you asked was, I guess, what can we do, right? Like, it has to be kind of rooted in action somewhere, right? Like we can have a philosophical debate about unity, but at the end of the day, what does it mean, right? Or what are we prepared to do in a space or in an environment of unity? And maybe this is part of it, just kind of like hashing it out, getting through the issues, bringing our own experiences to the space, and putting something together that we're all comfortable with sharing with the world. So that would be my take.
Okay. Professor, you just hit something in the comments. Talk about that.
Yeah, I think coming to common goals has been something that we've been doing a lot more of. Like I even noticed this past year, these past couple of years, seeing how Black conservatives and Black liberals are coming in more in agreement on police brutality as being a common goal of a common cause of interest on both parties. But I think what always ends up becoming the problem is what's the approach that we're going to take? What's the method that we're going to take to achieve said goal? And every group has their own opinions on how to reach that goal. I think there was only probably one time in my memory bank that I can remember where we tried to establish something that was going to get us to that point where we can have a collective agenda. I don't know if anybody remembers the State of the Black Union meetings that used to happen. I don't remember how I was so young when those were going on, but I remember seeing the playback when I was in Clark, Atlanta, and I remember seeing like how hectic it was in that room. But there were several ideologies and beliefs and different representations of us in that room, and they were having these conversations of, okay, you believe this, you believe that, but we all agree that we want to change this. Okay, so how are we going to do that? And you had a panel of like the most respected in the game on stage, from Cornel West to there was a rapper, there was a politician, there was this person, that person, and I don't necessarily feel like they led to, I could be wrong, that they led to anything, that it resulted in producing anything that was concrete. However, I thought it was a step in the right direction, and I would love to see that come back in some sort of fashion, those State of the Black Union, because it was a large platform. It happened every year. It was annual. I don't know necessarily why it stopped, but it was well respected, and I thought it was a step in the right direction of getting some of that Black unity, and having those collective conversations that were necessary. And I also think, however, though, I think one of our problems with the State of Black Union is that it was televised. I feel like those kind of conversations shouldn't have been televised. It shouldn't have been like a mass production on TV, like CNN was showing it, CBS was showing it. I think it's if you're gonna get those well-respected leaders from these different groups within our community together, I think that should be a private conversation amongst us that we should have on our own, to keep the politics and the clout away from it, and have a serious conversation on what do we agree on, what approaches do we agree on. Okay, cool. Now we have an agenda, we have a plan. Now let's work towards policy change.
Right. Okay, and I think I hear a lot around communication has to be a little more effective. Communication has to be much more private. And to go to Hanif's example, when he talked about the music, I'm sure as a composer in your head, you're having a million conversations with yourself. If you were putting that same composition together, would you do it publicly? and invite input, Hanif?
The only way I would do it publicly and invite input is if I was doing it for a teaching tool. But on a normal basis, no. It's not going to be in public until it's ready.
Okay. The other piece, so communication is essential. I think the other piece is, Terrence, I remember the conversations when they had that organizational effort. I remember that. You're right. It was on C-SPAN. It was on everything. The problem, well, I think that's a bad start. One of the challenges is the fact that half of these people were not representing any large body organizations. They didn't come to the table with if they were in organizations, they didn't come with their organization's objectives. They didn't break down what their strategic planning process was. They never got to the point where they talked about the overlapping strategies and how they can work together. I may be Muslim, you may be Christian, but at the same time, there are a million other areas that we can actually work on together. So when we talk about synthesizing those strategic strategies and saying, and just really putting a plan in place to say, how can we get these 10 organizations to work together on that effort since they've already started? When we talk about unity, I think it's more of a planning process, more than a clashing of theories or schools of thought. So what do you guys think about that? I'm just kind of curious. Minnie, you've been quiet, so I'm putting you on the spot, and the finger went up just in time.
I was about to, I felt it. It's crazy to me that I love the metaphor that Hanif used, because we really only are like a half a beat apart. It matters, but we really are like just missing each other. And I think maybe it's because people think we have to agree on the how. I don't think we're ever all going to agree on the how, but we don't have to. We got enough issues where, everybody can deal with it accordingly, but as long as we're all moving toward the same common goal, it's unrealistic to think everybody's going to want to solve problems the same way.
Right.
So we need to stop thinking like that, that we need to, agree on the how. We're not going to televise these conversations that we have. We have to have a system to control the flow of information. The Underground Railroad wouldn't have been successful had there not had been a system for controlling information. If we're going to have these conversations privately, we need the platform to distribute the information to the masses, but also to our masses, not to everyone. We have to control the flow of information. We need a system. We need a code. We need an agenda. We need a system. And in that order, but we don't always have to agree in not any one agenda, even though we'll have one, generally speaking, but different locations, different groups of people have different issues or have issues that are unique to their situation. So everybody still needs the freedom to address those things as individual components of the whole, if that makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Nick, I seen you about to say, I'm getting good. I seen the hand about the raise. Go for it.
Yeah, see, what Minnie said when she talked about the Underground Railroad, now the thing about that, this hits into, one of my areas of expertise as a musician and music teacher, is a lot of the messages in the Underground Railroad were remnants of the culture that was taken away from them, that they were able to disguise it. Like a lot of times when we go to these concerts, these Black History performances, we hear songs like Wade in the Water, and we don't even know that what Wade in the Water really was a covert communication for what you need to do when you get to this point, in the Underground Railroad, or Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Like a lot of these Negro spirituals were really coded messages. So the way they were able to use music to get through the day was also the same way they were able to pass through messages. Because what we have to understand, and I mean, this may seem off topic, but trust me, it's not. What we have to understand about this is that the reason why the drums were taken away from them here in this continent is because the slave masters realized, wait a minute, they know how to communicate with this thing, because their languages were not phonetic languages. They were oral languages. And the patterns of drumming were literal words that were being used to communicate. So when that was taken away, they found a way to continue to preserve their culture, as well as to continue to pass messages in ways that no one knew. So when we talk about the dissemination of information when it comes to unity, we have to look at, not just what do we use in terms of the technology and tools, but how do we continue to use the culture that we have? And in this country, Black culture is I don't want to say fractured or splintered as much as it is. It's very diverse because Black culture, in New York is slightly different than certain parts of New England and is very different in certain aspects of the South. But there's still a lot of things that are in common. So it's very critical that, at least from my perspective, when we talk about the dissemination of information, that we do it in a way, especially if we're trying to make sure that we know and that everyone else doesn't know, that we do it in a way that is common to everyone, that everyone's going to understand.
Okay. Tom?
Yeah, I'm going to just, my addition to that, and it's really going to ride on something that Minnie just said, is, what and how speak to process, right? And, the process is the thing you develop, right? Why is sort of the goal, the reason, right? The motivation. And, I really do think that, as Black folks, like folks have been saying, like, my experience in the Bronx is different than your experience in Springfield, right? Is different than someone's experience in, let's say, Chicago or Oakland or Savannah. And with that said, what we bring to the table is going to be different, right? Our experience, our position, our point of view is going to be different, right? But what we ultimately agree on is the why, and we have to. You get the why first, and after that, like, this is, like, I look at the, over the last few years, really the conversation around, like, police brutality, right? And everybody universally agrees that, like, the police need to stop killing us. And it just manifests itself differently in different places. But everybody agreed to the why, right? Like, we are doing this because police are killing us and this needs to stop. And, it plays itself out in different ways, the what and the how. But everybody agrees. And I think if we're going to talk about a movement in unity, right, that we do have to agree on the why first, like, get that. And I think that's going to be the easy part. It's the process part that's going to hang everyone up. But, that's the part where, if we're all able to sit back and really pay attention to each other and understand that my experience is different than yours and yours is different than mine, then we can develop a how and a what that really gets us where we need to go.
Okay. Similar to how they did in Atlanta. We look at Atlanta this past election, the runoff, in terms of how they went about accomplishing such a feat. They had the Black congressman down there, the way that they went about it, text message, emails. They did a lot of public work, but, for my relatives down in Atlanta, down the Georgia area, they were talking about how they would hit up people knocking on doors, personal conversations. They showed me text messages saying, do not share this publicly. Do not share this on Facebook. The way they went about doing it, I think communication is critical. The other piece is, let me just back off for a second. As we talk about this, is the first order of business taking white people out of our conversation as we talk about Black unity? Because oftentimes there's a whole lot of they and them, and we make constant references to them as we're talking about us. Minnie, go.
Hell yeah, we got to take them out of our conversations. And every single one of us needs to remove the white person in us. Because we all got a white person in us to some extent, where we define ourselves through their perspectives. And yes, we need to get rid of, I'm not saying all white people, and I'm not saying indefinitely either. But yeah, we need to clean house and get to the core of who we are before we even start creating strategic alliances with other groups of people. Yes, we need to get ourselves straight, and it's hard. You're not gonna be able to do that when you're in the same room. Just like if you got a victim is not gonna be telling their story or going through therapy in the same room as
perpetrator.
the perpetrator. Exactly. Yeah, that's how.
And I think there are probably some people watching who would disagree. Well, you know, a lot of white people are allies. I think the same way, I don't know if it was Tom who said it, I think it's really about people getting directives and action steps. Some people aren't thinkers. Some people are like, yo, give me my instructions and let me go do what I got to do. I think when it comes down to our white allies, if you're really aligned with me and you're an ally, this is what I need you to do. A, B, C, and D. The other conversations we're having in our kitchen, don't worry about that. So I agree. I think we got to kind of rid ourselves of the car. Oh, you said that was brilliant. Get rid of the white person inside of us. Yo, we got to deprogram ourselves, get that colonizer mentality out of here so that we can move forward. Tom, I see your finger up.
Yeah, you know, I think back during the summer, right? So I took my kids to a Black Lives Matter children's march, right? And I found myself bumping into more white people than black people in the space. And it bothered me because for some reason, like the conversation about police brutality, especially this past summer, only seemed to have legitimacy because white people were part of the conversation, right? And for me, I'm just like, no, like if this is my issue, allow me as a black person to bring my issue to the table. I don't need you to legitimize my issue, right? Like I don't need you for that. Like you said, I need you to do stuff, but I don't need you to legitimize my issue or delegitimize my issue, right? And that's what's been happening historically. Like, you know, we are systematically ignored until it affects them, right? Or until their issue kind of looks like ours. It's the same thing where if you look at like drug abuse, right? It was a crime for us, but a health crisis for them.
Right. Okay, I think
the problem is like, but we have to assert ourselves in that space and just be like, nah, you can't own my problem. Let me own my problem, bring it to you. And this is what we as a black people need for you to do as a white people. And I'm completely good with that.
And I think the Black Lives Matter is a perfect example of what Minnie was saying in terms of keeping them on the outside. Eventually, somebody figured out when the cops started shooting rubber bullets and, you know, pepper spraying everybody, you do what? You move all the white people to the front of the line. So we got to have our allies, but they need to understand their role and they need to know their place. The other piece, when we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, there were even dissension in the ranks there because as we're going after the police department, we were still losing equity in terms of employment opportunities. We had no political voice. The people sitting around the table discussing Black Lives Matter and what we would get, what they would negotiate on and what they wouldn't, didn't look anything like us. And even for those of us who worked with those white folks in those capacities in municipalities across the country, we still weren't in those rooms. Those were white people in those rooms determining. So I think there are a number of things. We talk about outcomes and what we hope to accomplish. I think we need to determine what the outcomes are and how we're going to achieve them, what roles, the benchmarks, the responsibilities. I think we have to delegate that, and I think we have to back into that. So I just want to go real quick to what Malcolm has said about Black unity, if that's cool with y'all. And I think Rob Jones had a comment. I'm going to read that real quick. How do we keep the message / movement on track / code between foundational Black Americans and non-foundational Black Americans towards common overarching Black goals? Personal opinion, when it comes down to get into the conversation of foundational Black Americans, and for those who don't know, we're looking at those folks in America who were descendants of slaves in America. I think there's much common ground, Rob. I think when you talk about slavery impacted all of the Western Hemisphere. I'm starting to watch more BBC shows with, with films by Black filmmakers as they talk about the oppressive forms of racism that they dealt with over in the UK. We don't deal with that because we only focus on our own problems. But when you have those same people coming from an extremely racist environment and they come over here, it's not that they don't get foundational Black Americans. When we talk about folks in the island, my grandmother's from Antigua. The Queen ruled Antigua even after independence. They still dealt with like rabid racism. So the thing is, we can't just disassociate ourselves. I think we have to do a better job of educating folks on what the real issues are. We don't necessarily do that at all times, but we have to do a better job. Our families are so heavily integrated with West Indians that you really can't say, well, they're foundational, because if that's the case, then I shouldn't be a part of this conversation as, the descendant of an immigrant from Antigua. So I think we have to be real careful with our language, because what we don't want to do is cause further division. And I think sometimes we do that. I'm not sure how other people feel, so I'll let other people talk about Rob's comment regarding the foundational Black Americans and non-foundational Black Americans. Anybody want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll chime in.
All right. And before you do, I think that's like that's one of those distraction type comments. Rob's gonna. It's a straight distraction because it pits us against us as we're trying to figure out how to overcome them. But go ahead, Anif.
Having had this conversation with Rob several times, I think one of the things that he's trying to pinpoint at is that it's not the case with everyone, but there have been cases, I know I've experienced it personally, where there are people that have come here from other countries, whether it's Europe, whether it's from somewhere in the Caribbean, and it's an attitude that they've experienced, like, well, you're not really Black enough because I'm from here and this is where things are, or, and it's been on both ends of the spectrum, where the one that is not, as Robert called, foundational Black American has looked down on someone that's foundational Black American, or the one that is a foundational Black American has looked down on someone that isn't. And I think it's like, that in and of itself is a separate issue, so at least in my mind it is. No, it's not really a separate issue. It's the same game that's going on all around the world of getting everyone to hate everyone that looks similar to anyone else. I mean, You see that when it comes to the European breaking into China. What's the first thing that they tell them? Don't trust Black people. You see it in India. My first trip in India, you see the way they treat people who are darker in India, and how the number one product in a corner store in India is skin lightening cream. So these things that Rob is talking about, I get why he's saying it to a certain extent, but at the same time, it's kind of like we're majoring on a point that's more of a distraction to the greater point. It's not that the point isn't important, but it can kind of fit into let's first agree on our overall goals as to what it is that we need to be doing and what it is that we need to be getting at.
Okay. And before we go to Tom, I just want to point out, if we operate on that principle, if we operate on just the whole focus of Black unity on that basic principle alone, remember who you'd be eliminating: Marcus Garvey, Noble Drew Ali, Stokely Carmichael, aka Kwame Ture. The list goes on and on and on. There are so many people of West Indian descent or non-foundational Black Americans who have helped to shape our perception of ourselves. So I think we have to be very, very, very careful. Stephen Biko's I live and die every time I read that man's biography. Without people like that, non-foundational Black Americans, I think we lose a lot. I think the other pieces, those are family conversations. I have brothers that I don't necessarily get along with. Don't mean that my children won't play with theirs. I think we have to work that out. That's the conversation that we don't go public with. But go ahead, Tom.
I think I could sum it up kind of in one sentence, right? It don't matter what boat you came in on, we all in the same boat now, right? The rest of it is a distraction. And, if the boat is sinking, then what do we do to keep it from sinking, right? It don't matter, where you came from. You on a sinking ship. What are you going to do about it? And, I just think that's sort of the best approach to take, instead of sort of nitpicking at who's light skinned or who's dark skinned, who from the islands, who was born here, was you born in the North or South? To me, that's actually almost irrelevant in terms of the issue, right? There's the experience we bring, right? That's the boat you came in on. And then there's we're all in the same boat now, means no matter what your experiences is, your historical experiences, there is a shared experience that we all have right now.
Right. We're all behind enemy lines, bottom line, and we're fighting with ourselves. But at the same time, Tom, let me just argue the reasons why when we talk about Black unity, one of the reasons why we don't have it is because we get caught up in all those little trivial distractions: light skin, dark skin, educated versus non-educated, the ex-con versus the guy who's never going to jail, the short guy versus the tall guy. We get caught up in so many friggin' distractions. we get hit with the distractions and it ends up turning into all these internalized beasts. And I think it goes back to what Minnie said earlier. I'm actually agreeing with Minnie. Get the white boy out your head. Got to get him out of your head. You got to rid your colony. You can't bring up issues like that. That just tells me you're still dealing with that colonizer mentality. We got to rid that. Demetrius Chambly, what's up, Demetrius? On the sideline says we need to tell our white supporters to do more marching in their neighborhoods where these racists live. I agree. And I think as we talk about racial equity, that has to be part of our strategy. Are we the ones that take this argument before white folks? Or do we let another white guy go back and address and have that conversation with another white guy about how wrong he is? We have to be in a position where we can give them their marching orders. You go march. You're an attorney, you're a politician. You need to go deal with them attorneys and politicians on what we need. I think we have to give them marching orders. We tend to get in rooms of white people and we acquiesce to them because we always want to make them feel comfortable. But I think to get to that point, as many stated, and I'm going to keep saying it, we have to get the white folks out of our heads so we can figure out exactly what our goals, objectives, benchmark strategies, and expected outcomes are. If we don't do that, then our grandkids will be having the same conversation in 25, 30 years. Anybody? Professor Mack, you've been quiet, brother. Go ahead, Minnie.
I think that also it's an egotistical thing as far as thinking that everybody has to agree with the method or the strategy. It's an ego thing. That's someone saying, no, do it my way or do it this way because I'm right and you're wrong. You know what I mean? And that's stumbling block. And we have the slavery has embedded in us and innately too as being African people, but the spirit of competition. Like we're always in competition. And when you try to get, kids from Africa to compete with each other, they don't. You're like, you ask them to race to something, and whoever gets there gets that thing, and they hold hands and they run together. You know what I mean? So we got to think in along those lines and stop seeing each other as it's a scarcity mindset too. That there's not enough success and there's not enough resources for everybody to do things the way they want to do things. That's a scarcity mindset, and that's going to keep us broke. And also, we need to balance the masculine and feminine energy in these organizations. A lot of organizations are for Black people or Black women. We don't function harmoniously in that sense. And I think that when these organizations, and we talked about this before, when you have two male-led organizations coming together, that ego, is a lot. It's a big stumbling block. Like how the U.S. slaves and the Black Panther Party, how COINTELPRO was able to create such dissension between organizations because pride wouldn't let two men sit down together and have a conversation about their issues. You know what I mean? So that pride and that ego is a big thing. But mothers, we work together. You know what I'm saying? So that's what I mean when I say we need to balance that masculine and feminine energy within these organizations also.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up the Black Panthers and Milana Karenga's organization, US. We have to be cognizant of the fact that as we organize, there are going to be outside influences trying to penetrate. And when we talk about ego, and this is actually a male and a female, so I think we balance. Watch this, and this is what we deal with when we try and come together. We have two.
I said masculine, feminine energy. I didn't say males and females.
No. I dig you.
Okay.
I dig you. We good. So this is Elaine Brown and Milana Karenga talking about each other. Both of them on the right path. The Panthers and that 9-point and that 9-point plan. Milana Karenga talking about the Afrocentric values. This is what we ended up getting from the two of them.
They drew first. Us people drew in defense, and that's when the shootout happened. It's a tragic mistake.
I don't understand why no one doesn't get that Chuck Chasey, for any intents and purposes, as much of an FBI operative as anybody. He kills these two men. He shoots John in the back, and Bunchy turns around unarmed and gets shot straight up in the chest.
The Panthers and the left then began to lie about us say we were agents, say we killed the Panthers.
This wasn't some casual event that happened accidentally when tempers flared. This was a planned assassination of leaders of the Black Panther Party for a very specific reason. Because as J. Edgar Hoover had said, we were the greatest threat, and he was going to eliminate that threat.
And I bring them, I play that video. Oh, I think I'm frozen. But I play that video because both organizations were on the right path in terms of one talking about Afrocentric value system and the other one putting together expected outcomes for our community. Imagine Elaine Brown, one of the most powerful, I probably say one of the most brilliant leaders the Black Panther Party has ever had. Imagine if her and Malana Karenga were actually to sit down and had worked together instead of them going to war on the streets like gangs. So I think we get caught up with distractions and we don't pay attention to the outside influences. So I'm gonna read some of the sideline comments. Here we go. Ricardo Wilson says, I think we need to get back to the Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X days of showing our presence in the streets by the numbers in a militant form. Rob Jones says, how does the term people of color dilute the focus on Black initiatives? Anybody wanna? Tom, I see you.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to. I was thinking about Ricardo's comment, and okay. I think my response or my opinion would be that there's a place for both, right? Like I go back to the civil rights movement, and there was just as much of a place for those who sat at the lunch counters, right, as it was for the Nation of Islam and the Black Panther Party to take to the streets, right? I think sometimes we get caught into things one way or the other, right? Like it has to be militant or it has to be like sitting at the lunch counter, right? It can be some combination of both, or it can be something different than both of those, right? And that's a function of who's coming to the table, right? Like if we allow folks that come to the table to come with their experience, right? And not really get stuck in this my way or the highway mentality, but say, you know what? Black Panther Party, you take it to the streets, right? While I go and sit at the lunch counter, while the next person goes and decides they're gonna sit on the front of the bus, and you have a coordinated plan that really respects what everybody brings to the table. It doesn't have to just be one way.
Absolutely. I think to Hanif's point, when he started out earlier, when he talked about the composition, imagine if we took Booker T's brilliance around Black people owning land. He said, yeah, I'll take your second-class status. Just give me the land. We get the land. We can farm on our own. We can live on our own. We go to Marcus Garvey's brilliance when he says we need to be a nation. If we were to act and function like a nation, the Asians in this country function as an independent nation within America. The Jews function as an independent nation. That's what Marcus was talking about. Imagine if we took the brilliance of W.E.B. Du Bois and we said, you know what? We need that academic intellectual portion of our community. We need to further their development. We look at, Malcolm, and he talks about these issues are not civil rights issues. We're already their equal, more than their equal. But what we're talking about is equity. We're talking equity. We're talking human rights. We take Martin Luther. I mean, we would take all these great people, mold it into one thought. I think we can move forward instead of looking at them competitively. Go ahead, Hanif.
But when we also talk about equity, the one thing I want to say, and whether people agree with it or not, is irrelevant to me. But the one thing I'm going to say is that you can't even begin this conversation about equity and equality for Black people, and when it comes to racism, things we've experienced, if you're not talking about economic empowerment. Because none of these things, like let's look at the communities you talked about that Marcus Garvey talked about, that act as independent nations, as an independent nation within this nation. Both of those communities got money.
Absolutely.
And, if we're not talking about what we do, if economic empowerment is not part of the how we do and part of the plan, then the plan is doomed to fail. Because everyone that makes a move in this country for their group's interest, whether it's, ethnic interest, whether it's political interest, they do so with money. And they do so with organization. with using organizations and various different things, you know, and I think that's one of the things we have to look at. And it kind of falls in line with what Tom is saying, because, you know, if I've got $10 million and we've got something and we're trying to fund these different things, and everyone's like, well, you know, we got this, you know, we need some people out here to protect, you know, these people that, you know, want to do this peaceful thing in case it gets violent, or we need some people that can go up to Washington. All these things cost money. So we have to remember that economic empowerment must be a cornerstone of our strategy. Otherwise, we're only going to get but so far. It's going to be similar to conversations that we've had on this panel before. We're going to get so far, and then we're just going to step back because we don't have the resources to finish what we started.
I agree with you 100%, Hanif. Going back to Ricardo Wilson, when he talks about the, you know, just the militant presence, we need people to defend us. We've gotten to the point where we've had industrious communities and they were destroyed and everything was taken from us. So economic development is critical. So we have all these brilliant organizations and entities across the globe, across the country, in the Black community. We have organizations that can focus on economic development. I look at a lot of these young people. They got these circles of creatives all working together and supporting each other. We have to do that. Tom mentioned Gary, Indiana, with Richard Hatcher. I'm not sure if people are familiar with Gary, Indiana, and what Hatcher did down in Gary. When the Democratic Party down there refused to allow them entry, they created their own party. I think that was the 21st District Democratic Party. And then what he did when he got in office, his thing wasn't social justice. He was where you're at, Hanif. He got all the Black contractors to pool their resources. So instead of them just paving a parking lot, they began to pave at the major airport down there. They got all the paving contracts and they paved all the municipal and state properties within the Gary, Indiana area. He said all those contractors working. So I think we got to go back and take lessons from history. Most of us call ourselves students of history, but we don't really read history and look at some of the brilliant strategies that they implemented back then to see what is practical today. I think a lot of this, I think what Hatcher did, oh my God, he set the tone for Black, when people say I'm the first Black mayor, but did you do what Richard Hatcher did? If you haven't done that, then you're just another chocolate-covered white boy who is doing us no good. So this dude brought everybody together. So when we talk about that, Hanif, you're absolutely right. I think we need that militant form. There's some cats who just lethal with their hands and they can shoot a gun. We need people like the Proud Boys. All the white boys coming together, they don't all agree. They come from different backgrounds. You have judges, lawyers, doctors, teachers, landscapers, truck drivers. They come together. You have the cats who walk around with the guns and you have the cats who are running for office. They don't agree, but they come together and they stay, as Rob always says, they stay on code. So I don't think it's an issue of whether we do economic development, create a military arm, a militant arm, or create, whatever the case may be. I think it's not an either or situation. These are all the objectives that we have. This is the plan. Let's organize this shit and let's make it happen. Professor, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was thinking on what Minnie was saying earlier about how we don't have to pick, we shouldn't be focusing on picking just one approach and one method.
Absolutely.
But okay, so we were talking about economics, right? So say in the sense of group economics, what do you do when approaches conflict with one another? You'll have for example, one group of Black people who feel that in order for us to get economic power in this country, we need to separate and we need to focus on group economics, and we need to focus on supporting only Black businesses and then supporting only Black learning spaces and so on and so forth, right? But then you got another group which is probably more Republican and conservative, and they say no, segregation is the wrong way, integration is the right way. Two conflicting approaches. So how do we in a situation like that, right? Trying to come on a common goal, a common agreement on a goal for economic change, which is one of many causes that we often debate in our community. How would we handle said situation?
All right, we have two hands up. Ladies first. Ms. Jones.
Okay, that's why I said we need a code. You understand what I'm saying? We need a system of self-governance when it comes to solving these issues, just like we used to have when we had that, when it was a tribal thing. So first, if we have a code, we can determine whether or not they're on or off code. If they are on code, then the focus becomes how we support each other.
Right.
We're not all going to agree. We have to stay on code. And if we can't deduce amongst ourselves whether or not someone's actions or a group of people's actions are on code, we take it to a tribunal. We take it to the elders. Because either the behavior needs to be addressed and modified, or the code needs to be addressed and modified. You understand what I'm saying? And when you have a code, you understand where you are, you can also place things on the spectrum. Like, whoa, y'all way left. But as long as you're on code, we're going to give y'all that right and the opportunity to be, and we're going to support each other in the way that we want to live our lives. If y'all want to live with white folks, that's fine. Stay on code. As long as you stay on code, that's fine. If that's what the code says, stay on code. But if you refuse to be on code, and the majority of us are in agreement with that, then there's got to be procedures and guidelines for how you handle situations like that. But there's room for everybody to be who they are. But it's important that first and foremost we have a code.
Okay, Hanif and then Tom.
Just like we've been saying with a lot of other things, there is, when we talk about Mac's question, there is absolutely room for both. And in fact, we're seeing it. I have read at least in the last 5 or 6 months, I've read at least 7 articles where groups of Black people have bought land and are building cities strictly for Black folks in this country, for their own towns, own governments, own businesses, everything Black. And to be honest, I mean, and this is my perspective, I think you're going to need a little bit of both, because you're going to need a place where you can go to and not have to worry about, provided, as many said, everyone is on code and everyone knows what the code is and everyone is in agreement with that. But you also need people that can continue to learn more about where they are in order to empower others to be able to do better. Because, like D, firsthand from your experience that had you not been where you were, there's certain things that would not have been able to happen for the communities that you serve because no one would have known what to do or what to say. So we need that. We also need that knowledge and that expertise. There is room for both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And if someone is advocating for one or the other, what that really says to me is that you're not really about the community as a whole. You're about drawing acolytes to yourself. And you're about getting, becoming the big I, the big chief, the one that everyone goes to, versus looking at the fact that everyone doesn't think that way. And, if you want things to happen, especially in this country, you're going to need a mixture of things. And that's going to come down to who can do what. I've said it on the show before, back in my days when I was a big pro wrestling fan. It's my favorite line by my favorite pro wrestler, The Rock: know your role and shut your mouth. In this case, to shut your mouth means know your role and do it.
Do it, yeah.
Period.
There we go. Tom, you had your hand up, and then we are at the 1 hour mark. So once Tom finishes his thoughts, we'll have some closing thoughts from everyone. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah. So, to answer Mac's question and to, in a way, like co-sign what Hanif is saying, like, I think there is room for both, right? So you will have times when, the way we should do things, will diverge, right? So either it's integration or segregation, right? Like, but I think what we can do is, if we allow for the creation of spaces that respect both, right? Like, there may be some times when Black folks might just want to, start their own town and do their own thing. And that's just as okay as, having a class that represents the community, right? Like, I think there are ways that, like, it doesn't have to be either or. And I think the problem is we spend too much time making it either or. Part of the problem, again, is when we talk about unity, it means everyone, right? And it means respecting everyone and where they come from, right? The minute it becomes, me versus, then it's not unity anymore, right? Unity is respect for, again, people's experience and what they bring to the space. And the goals and solutions should also reflect, right, what people's experiences are. So that was my addition to it.
All right. And for those who just tuning in, we're about to close off, but we were talking, just so folks understand what we were talking about. It had nothing to do with white people. It's really about black people coming together and really defining and discussing what black unity actually means. I see what the brother's saying. Integration hasn't worked for us. Come on, y'all. Integration means white. It absolutely means white. It absolutely means assimilation and whiteness. I get that. But at the same time, before the majority of us can get to that point, we have to understand what everything means to be black. It means how do we maintain our blackness without compromising ourselves. Talks about where do we negotiate, how do we negotiate. It talks about developing a process so that we can all come together. I think that's more important than wondering whether or not we're going to integrate or segregate from white people. I think we need to get our act together first. To Minnie's point, I think I'm going to sum up her thing with 3 words: accountability, reward, consequences. We need to know where the parameters are. We need to know that there has to be a system of accountability. When we talk about, to Mac's question, in terms of how far people go, where they go, whether we do it together, I think people need to understand if you don't stay on code, there will be a consequence. And accountability has to happen. One of the things we don't do, we allow the Candace Owens folks of the world to get off and just really smashing black people publicly and speaking on our behalf at the same time. I think we have to decide who speaks for us. Freak what white people think. But I think if Daryl Moss steps off code, what's the accountability going to be? What's the consequence going to be? Doesn't mean you have to kill me, but it means that, okay, we're gonna whitelist this dude. He gets absolutely nothing. Everybody needs to stay on code. Otherwise, it defeats the purpose of even coming up with a code. We don't have that mechanism. As it pertains to people wanting to separate or stay with white people and just integrate into their colonies, it's cool. I'm with Hanif. People need to decide what they're going to do. I mean, example, Alabama, we have 152 acres of land. We're about to negotiate for another 111. We're all moving back down there and developing our own little community separate from everybody. As long as we have a means to make money and ensure that it thrives from food, the whole 9 yards, we can grow food. So for those who think that we can't do it and it's impossible, no, it's not impossible. We just have to do what we do. Does it mean that's the end all to be all for everybody? Absolutely not. But we need to develop a process where we can get all these schools of thoughts coming together and we can function. Go ahead, Hanif. And Hanif, when you start yours, also make yours a closing thought so we can move forward. Yes, sir.
And on that same token, we need to not belittle people who do not do it the way we think they should.
If it's Candace Owens, I'm going to belittle her.
Now, Candace is different. Well, yeah, but on the real, when you talk about a Candace Owens, she's just a paid mouthpiece. She don't even really mean half of what she's saying in the first place. But when it comes to these things, like, look, we have to stop belittling people that don't think like we do. We don't always have. Once again, we don't have to agree on the methods, but we do need to agree on the what. We need to agree on the what and the why. The how is different. The how is going to be based on who you are, what's available, and what you're willing to do. Because everyone is not willing to go out and take the same steps. Everyone is not willing to risk the same things, and everyone's not willing to sacrifice the same. So I just want to say that, and like as far as like closing thought, is unity possible? It is absolutely possible as long as we have the correct definition of unity. Unity does not mean that we all have to think the same thing, do it the exact same way. It just means that we have to agree on a common purpose. We have to agree on what's the why, what's the what, the how that we get to it. It's different. And everyone can find what their how is, as long as we're pursuing it, as long as we like many have said many times, as long as we are on code, as long as we have that accountability, as long as that we have those frameworks in common, the how can be a multitude of ways.
Okay. Let's see. Terrence. We're looking at closing thoughts. All that.
I echo. Hadith said everything I was going to say. But yes, just to echo what he mentioned. I do agree that we all different strategies can be acknowledged and coexist. But there again, as you were saying, needs to be that common goal. Those common goals that we agree that we need to collectively all put our attention towards. And I'm down for. I'm always down to be a part of those discussions. I think On Deck is an example of one of those discussions where different all sorts of Black people come together and we're having these different conversations from different perspectives and beliefs and backgrounds. So I'm always down to create more spaces like this and be a part of more spaces like this, and I think that's steps moving towards the right direction.
Okay, thank you, Tom.
I guess for a closing thought, I would just add this. As people, our experiences and what we bring to the table are very different. And again, if we're going to talk about unity, then unity should more reflect our goals than this idea of identity politics, right? And with that said, like, it's okay to be who you are in a space. That's the starting point, right? Like we have that as a goal, and ultimately we develop plans and structures to get there. I think that we can certainly do that, and we have examples in the past that we can look to as we look to sort of create our own future in the way that we as a people feel like we should have.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Jones. You're on mute.
I just feel like when it comes to opinions, criticisms, about the way people decide to contribute to the liberation of the African diaspora, ask yourself, like, are they really hurting the people? You know what I mean? Could they use some support, or maybe they're on the right track, they're just misguided. So instead of pointing fingers and saying they're doing it wrong, say, how can I help them get it right? And that's it. This is help each other. Let's just focus on helping each other and determining how we can best support each other, regardless of how our ideals or our strategies are different. Just ask, how can I be of service?
Okay. I want to thank everybody for being here again today. There's a million other things you all could have been doing, but you chose to be here and share your perspectives on deck. My closing thoughts, Hanif, I agree with you. It's hard to point fingers, but I look at Denmark Vesey and how successful he could have been. But that open arm thing, because people are Black, just didn't work out for him. I look at what happened to Malcolm X, and the number of Black people who felt they were doing what was best for Black people ended up causing his death and the demise of his agenda. I look at what happened with Marcus Garvey and how Black people turned against him, and he ended up getting set up for the mail fraud. There's just so many examples of so many people who are cancers to our community. I just feel like there has to be accountability mechanisms in place. So I agree, Minnie, we should all be super helpful and extending arms. But then there are some people who are just cancers to our community and those folks have to be addressed. I don't think that everybody operates in the best intentions for Black people. I think it's not just a simple accusation for some people. I think some people should be explored, investigated, and we have to come to the conclusions whether or not we can continue working with certain entities within our community. Are they destructive? Are they cancerous? Are they working in our best benefit? And if not, we need to have a collective conversation to find out what's being done. Historically, the Black community has never looked at it. We never look and say, okay, well, I can't stop them from doing what they did. There are so many people who just do so many vile and nefarious things within our community and they get passes. I just think that as we talk about Black unity, I think we also need to talk about the perimeters, and we need to talk about, who gets a ticket for inclusion into that conversation. If someone has a body of work and they have proven that everything they've done is just the antithesis to what we're hoping to accomplish, then I think there has to be a mode of accountability, just like we address economic development, just like we address advancement within the STEM fields within our community. Just like we discuss business ownership, land ownership, equity, police brutality, I think we also need to talk about perimeters within our community. I think if we're going to move forward, we got to have mechanisms to shut certain people down. And if we don't do that, then we're doing our folks a grave disservice. Every time an organizational effort has been made historically within the Black community here, Africa, the Caribbean, over in Europe, it doesn't matter. Every time we attempt to take 2 steps forward, there's always someone in our community that takes that same private, covert conversation and they share it with the Western world, and we get sent back 4 or 5 paces. So that whole thing about, turn the other cheek, accept them, meet them where they're at. We meet them when they're at if if we determine that their intentions are pure and they're working in the best interest of our community. We have people who have proven over and over and over again that they're just as bad as the brother that turned in Nat Turner. Then at some point, there has to be a consequence. There has to be accountability. As long as we operate with no accountability, then we're screwing ourselves. So when Minnie talks about being on code, for me, that's what being on code means. To have somebody look at me and say, D, you a straight up Uncle Tom, you've been stuck. Yo, that's worse than a white boy calling me a nigga. I want to make sure at the beginning and ending of the day that my community can look at me and know that that's one Black man I can trust no matter what. If it gets to the point where my community is looking down at me, then no, it's not about making fun of them. It's not about helping them. It's about how do you eliminate the cancer in our circle. So everybody's entitled to an opinion, and I just shared my closing thought for the first time out of all the shows. I very rarely do. I just had to get that off my chest. As we talk about Black unity, folks, please take this conversation, make it a daily conversation. Talk about the values that we actually need to have to maintain these types of conversations and this type of dialogue. This is On Deck, y'all. Much love, much peace, much respect to you, and we'll see you later. Okay, if I can do this right.
God's walked in.